This is a memory from my early 20s that I usually keep buried. It's not something I bring up at dinner parties or share with therapists. Whenever I let my mind drift back to that winter, I get this heavy, cold feeling in my chest. Hard to describe. Maybe typing this out will finally exorcise it from my system, but who knows? I had taken a temporary contract at a remote archival facility in the Pacific Northwest. It was a restoration project for water-damaged government records, housed in a repurposed military barracks from the 1950s. I was there starting in October, and I ended up staying through the worst of the winter snowstorms. I shared a bunk room with this guy named Arthur. We weren't friends. We were just colleagues thrown together by the housing assignment, like everyone else on the project. But over time, you learn to tolerate the person breathing just 6 feet away from you. The room itself was sterile: concrete walls, 2 metal cots, 2 lockers, and a single drafty window that looked out onto the pine forest. After a few weeks, I started picking up on some unnerving habits about Arthur. For starters, he handed me a handwritten set of precautions regarding our shared space. It came completely out of the blue. He just walked up to me one evening while I was unlacing my boots, holding a crumpled napkin with neat, tiny handwriting on it, as if it were a standard roommate agreement. As if the delivery wasn't strange enough, the rules themselves were baffling. There were a bunch of arbitrary restrictions that didn't strictly make sense. I can't recall every single one, but apparently I wasn't allowed to leave any water in a glass overnight. Not a drop. As if I had any intention of hoarding stale water. I didn't even know why that would matter in a concrete dorm. But the weirdest thing on the list by far was the rule about whistling. Specifically, I was forbidden from whistling anything with a descending melody after sunset. You don't just accidentally whistle specific melodic structures, so I couldn't imagine why he felt the need to enforce that. What did he think? That I was going to perform an avant-garde flute solo in my sleep? That was absurd. Plus, the facility had a strict noise policy anyway, which added to the mystery. And beyond that, what kind of danger could a tune even pose? As far as I knew, musical allergies weren't a real medical condition. So I couldn't imagine what he was trying to prevent. It was just bizarre, especially because of how grave he looked when he handed it to me. You might be thinking he was messing with the new guy, but I'm telling you, Arthur was a void where a sense of humor should be. He also had this habit of scratching. Not his skin, but the surfaces around him. He would run his fingernails rhythmically against the metal frame of his cot, especially at night when the lights were out. Scritch, scritch, pause, scritch. I'd catch the rhythm of it sometimes, like Morse code, but there was never any pattern I could decipher. It was really unnerving at first, especially when the sound seemed to synchronize with the wind outside. But like everything else, I eventually desensitized myself to it. He also kept this heavy, leather-bound portfolio. That wasn't unusual. We were all archivists. We all liked old paper, until I realized how he treated it. The way he never let it leave his person made me think it was something valuable or illicit. But I was wrong. I knew for a fact he kept it wedged between the wall and his mattress, and my curiosity swelled over the weeks, ultimately getting the better of me. One afternoon, when he was on a shift in the basement levels, I felt around the side of his bed until I felt the cold leather. The vast majority of the pages were blank, but there were a few in the middle that were covered in charcoal sketches. It took me all of 2 seconds to realize what I was looking at. It was a series of architectural drawings of our room, but they were wrong. I flipped through them and realized that in every drawing, the perspective was from the ceiling, looking down. And in every sketch, I was in my bed, sleeping. But I wasn't alone. Drawn in heavy, frantic black charcoal, there were things standing around my bed. Tall, distorted figures with too many joints. I frantically scanned the pages for Arthur's bed, but in the drawings, his bed was always empty. The sketches weren't dated, which I figured was the only small mercy, but I had no idea what any of it meant. There wasn't anything else in the portfolio, just those scenes of me being watched by charcoal monsters. I tried rationalizing it. Maybe he was an artist. Maybe this was his twisted way of venting frustration about a snoring roommate. As I was sliding it back, I couldn't help but wonder why someone would hide art unless it was a confession. Were it not for the way Arthur guarded that thing like a holy relic, I probably would have brushed it off as a creepy hobby. But for whatever reason, seeing those drawings gave me this really sick feeling inside, like Arthur perceived reality differently than I did. Like he was seeing things that were actually there. For weeks after that, I was extremely paranoid that he somehow knew I had violated his privacy. I started worrying that he was going to act out the drawings. We didn't talk much to begin with, but I could have sworn I caught him watching my reflection in the window glass more often than before. This unexplainable sense of dread started hanging over me, and I gradually spent more and more time in the facility's break room. I had a few acquaintances on the project, and it got to a point where I was falling asleep on the break room sofa just to avoid going back. Then one night, something happened that made all my paranoia feel justified. I woke up randomly in the dead of night. I had no idea what time it was, but the snow was falling heavy outside, muffling the world. At first, I thought I had woken up to Arthur's scratching noise again, but as my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I realized the reality was much worse. Arthur wasn't scratching. That's because instead, he was crouched on top of his locker, literally perched like a gargoyle on the narrow metal box, knees up to his chest, staring directly at me. His head was tilted at an impossible angle, like a bird listening for a worm in the ground. I gasped. I couldn't help myself, and I scrambled backward against the wall. Despite my outburst, he didn't move. He didn't even blink. He just kept staring with these wide, wet eyes, balancing perfectly on a surface that shouldn't have held a grown man. The shock of having been woken up was one thing, but the sheer athleticism and unnatural stillness of it made it terrifying. When I finally stammered out his name, asking what the hell he was doing, he just whispered that the floor was too loud. Like that fragment of nonsense somehow explained why he was perched on furniture at 3 a.m. Like it was totally normal to avoid the floor because of noise. I didn't know what to say. I was still partly in shock, and the way he slowly, fluidly climbed down, limb by limb like a spider, discouraged me from asking any more questions. He crawled into his bed without another word. I stayed awake the rest of the night, gripping my blanket like a shield. The next morning, I tried bringing it up. I felt more rational and honestly more aggressive now that the sun was reflecting off the snow outside. But he acted bewildered, like he genuinely didn't know what I was talking about. Not in a defensive way either, more in a pitying way. Like he thought the isolation of the job was making me hallucinate. I couldn't decide whether he was a sociopathic liar or whether he truly sleepwalked through his own madness. I couldn't decide which was worse. After that, my fear only got worse. And not just of Arthur. It's hard to explain, but I started being afraid of the silence in the room. Even when he wasn't there, I felt like the air was thick, like the perspective drawings in his book were the reality, and I was just blind to it. Things only got worse. About 3 days later, I came back to the room after a shower to find a pile of wet, gray hair on my pillow. I'm not kidding. It looked like a clump of fur pulled from a drain, smelling of mildew. I yelled out in disgust and looked over at Arthur, who was sitting at his desk, repairing a binding on an old ledger. He didn't even turn around. He just said calmly that he found it in the vent and thought I should see it. When I asked why on earth he would put it on my pillow, he said something I will never forget. He said, "It belongs to the room. It wanted to be close to you." I didn't know what to say to that. I was worried that if I argued, he might snap. I had never seen rats or animals in the vents, but the building was old, so maybe it was possible. But what really freaked me out was when he walked over, picked up the wet clump with his bare hands, and gently placed it in his pocket. Like it was a pet. The whole thing, from finding the filth to his reverence for it, was repulsive. More repulsive than I'm describing. I didn't report it. My naive, contract employee self just couldn't risk losing the bonus pay by causing drama. That's the thing you have to remember. I needed the money. I wasn't in a position to demand a transfer. The breaking point came a few nights later. It started with what I thought was a fever dream. I was in that state of sleep paralysis, totally unable to twitch a muscle, and there was this vibration humming through the concrete floor. It wasn't a sound, it was a frequency rattling my teeth. From the dark corner of the room, near the heater, a shadow detached itself from the wall. It was tall, impossibly thin, and it moved with a jerking staccato rhythm. It wasn't Arthur, it was the thing from the charcoal drawings. It drifted toward the center of the room, and then, defying gravity, pulled itself up onto the ceiling. It crawled directly over my bed, looking down. I couldn't see a face, just a blur of static where features should be. Then, a long, gray arm reached down. The fingers were endless, dripping with something dark. It touched my chest. But before it could push down, it suddenly jerked back, hissing like steam escaping a pipe. And then it went completely berserk. It slammed into the lockers, throwing them open. It tore the heavy blackout curtains off the rod, and in one violent motion, it threw itself against the heavy oak door of our room. The second I heard the wood splinter, my eyes snapped open. Only my body was already curled into a defensive ball, like I had been anticipating a blow. And all at once, I realized why that was so terrifying. The door was actually destroyed. The heavy, solid core door was hanging off its top hinge, splintered inward. What's worse was that there were wood chips settling on the floor in real time, like it had just been smashed seconds ago. The rest of the room looked identical to the chaos in my dream. The lockers were open. The curtains were on the floor. Despite being confident that I was now awake, I still couldn't breathe. But it was the most terrifying moment of my life. I looked at the door and realized the impact marks were on the outside face, but the wood had buckled inward. The fear didn't go away, but the paralysis did. As soon as I could move again, my first thought was that Arthur had finally snapped. I spun around to his bed. He was fast asleep. He was even breathing in that slow, deep rhythm of the unconscious. But I wasn't going to let him gaslight me again. I started shaking him, knowing he was faking it, but he was dead weight. I kept shaking him, and the longer he stayed limp, the more desperately I wished he'd wake up and attack me. It was such a nasty feeling. I was terrified of him, but I was infinitely more terrified of the alternative. If my nightmare hadn't been a nightmare, then what had smashed our door? The moment I started thinking about that possibility, I started hyperventilating. I wanted to blame his insanity. I needed a human villain, but he didn't wake up. It was too much for me to handle. I backed away, grabbed my coat, and ran out into the hallway. I didn't know what else to do. The broken door was real. The torn curtains were real. The impossible strength required to shatter a hinge was real. A few minutes later, the facility security guard came running up the stairs, flashlight beaming. Arthur finally stumbled out of the room behind him, rubbing his eyes. He seemed genuinely shocked at the state of the door. I thought that meant we were finally on the same side, but no. Instead, he pointed at me and told the guard that I had been screaming in a language he didn't understand, thrashing in my bed, and that the force had come from me. I couldn't believe he was trying to frame me for telekinetic vandalism. He started backing away from me, making a sign with his hands, some warding gesture, and looking at me with pure horror, like I was the monster. Things get kind of blurry after that. The project lead was called. We were separated. I spent the rest of the night in the medical bay. When I woke up the next morning, the project manager came in. He looked tired. He told me that they had reviewed the hallway security cameras. That was the nail in the coffin. My brain was already working on a rational explanation. Maybe a bear had gotten into the building. Maybe a boiler exploded. But the manager's face destroyed it all. He said the cameras showed nothing. No one entered the hallway. No one left. The door just imploded. He told me they were terminating my contract early, with full pay, just to get me off the property. They framed it as a stress leave. When I asked about Arthur, the manager frowned. He said, "Who?" My stomach dropped. I explained, "Arthur, my roommate, the guy with the portfolio." The manager looked at me like I was insane. He told me I had been in a single room the entire time. There was no roommate assigned to bunk 4. I never saw Arthur again. Honestly, I don't remember much about packing my bags. I think my brain just shut everything down to preserve what little sanity I had left. I don't think I'll ever know who or what Arthur was, but I don't care. I've thought of every possible explanation. The Tyler Durden theory that I was hallucinating him, impossible. The physical evidence of the precautions, the charcoal drawings, I held them. I felt the paper. The door was broken, and I have trouble convincing myself that I did it. Not only because I have never been violent, but because of what I found in my coat pocket when I got home. I reached in to grab my keys and my fingers brushed against something soft and damp. It was a clump of gray, wet hair, wrapped in a piece of paper. On the paper, in that tiny, neat handwriting, were the words, "It follows the quiet ones." Something abnormal happened in those woods, and it terrifies me to think that I might have been the catalyst. That my nightmare hadn't been a nightmare, but an invitation. When I was 19, I took a gap year to apprentice with a master carpenter in a small coastal town called Oakhaven, up near the Canadian border. It was cheaper to rent a room in a local boarding house than to find an apartment, so I ended up at the Highwater Inn. The house was a Victorian monstrosity painted a peeling shade of gray, perched on a cliff that overlooked the churning Atlantic. It was mostly empty during the winter months. It was honestly more drafty hallway than house. My landlady, Mrs. Gable, was a sweet, frail woman in her 80s who smelled perpetually of lavender and mothballs. She gave me the turret room on the 3rd floor because it was the only one with a working heater. The ceiling was domed, and there was a single round window that looked out toward the lighthouse in the distance. Mrs. Gable lived on the ground floor because her hips were bad, and she rarely ventured upstairs. She told me she went to bed at 8 p.m. sharp, and that I should be careful on the stairs because the carpet was loose. I was a respectful kid. I spent my days sanding wood in the shop, and my evenings in that turret room, sketching designs or reading paperback thrillers. There wasn't much else to do there. The wind howled constantly, rattling the window pane like it wanted in. The first month went by without incident, but I started noticing weird things around mid-November. On one of the first stormy nights, I was lying in bed, staring at the shadows the lighthouse beam cast against the curved ceiling. I heard the floorboards creak in the hallway. They sounded heavy. Thump. Drag. Thump. I watched as the brass doorknob slowly turned. It didn't rattle. It just rotated with agonizing slowness. The door pushed open about 4 inches. I froze. As soon as I saw the door moving, I shut my eyes tight and pretended to be asleep. I honestly thought it was Mrs. Gable coming to check if I had turned the space heater off. She was paranoid about fires. I was worried she'd lecture me about the electricity bill, so I just lay there, breathing rhythmically. But I didn't hear anything after that. No receding footsteps. No sound of the door clicking shut. Just the whistling wind. I forced myself to sleep, assuming I had either missed Mrs. Gable leaving, or she was just standing there, confused in her old age. The next morning, I saw her in the kitchen making tea. I asked her if she had needed something last night. She looked at me with those cloudy blue eyes and laughed. She said her knees were acting up, and she hadn't climbed those stairs since 1998. She told me the house settles in the wind, and that the air pressure sometimes pops the doors open. I thought that was an especially strange explanation, because I was pretty sure I had seen the knob turn, not just pop. But I didn't want to argue. The footsteps had sounded too heavy to be her fragile frame anyway. So I just assumed it was a draft, and that my tired brain was playing tricks on me. 3 nights later, I woke up. Or at least I thought I woke up, because the air in the room had changed. It was freezing, despite the heater humming in the corner. There was someone sitting in the chair by my desk. It was pitch black, but I could see the silhouette against the faint light from the window. It was a bulky shape, wrapped in something heavy. I couldn't tell if it was Mrs. Gable wrapped in a quilt or an intruder, but it scared me nonetheless. I closed my eyes and silently counted to 60, waiting for them to say something or steal my wallet. When I opened them, the chair was empty. I convinced myself it had just been a hypnagogic hallucination, that state between dreaming and waking, but it didn't feel like one. When I got out of bed the next morning, my sketchbook, which I had left closed on the desk, was open. And not just open. The charcoal pencil had been dragged across the page, creating a thick, dark streak through my drawing. I started suspecting Mrs. Gable was sleepwalking. It was the only explanation that made sense to me. Elderly people sometimes do strange things when their minds start to slip, after all. Maybe she walked in her sleep, completely unaware of her bad hips. It was scary, but I didn't want to bring it up to her again out of fear of embarrassing her or getting kicked out. The rent was too good to lose. Similar things happened periodically over the course of that winter, and when it came time to leave in the spring, I was relieved. When my dad drove up to help me move my boxes, I told him everything. He chuckled and said old houses have personality. He told me I had an overactive imagination from reading too many mystery novels, and that Mrs. Gable was probably just a lonely old lady checking on her only tenant. He said I should be flattered she cared enough to check on me. That made me feel like maybe I really was just being dramatic. I moved out, finished my apprenticeship, and never went back to Oakhaven. Years went by. I moved to the city, started my own furniture business, and forgot about the Highwater Inn. 10 years later, I was at a trade show in Boston. I was looking at a booth selling antique maritime equipment, compasses, sextants, that sort of thing. The guy running the booth looked vaguely familiar. He was about my age, maybe a little older, with a scar running through his eyebrow. We got to talking, and it turned out he was Julian, Mrs. Gable's grandson. It took less than a minute for the nostalgia to kick in. He told me Mrs. Gable had passed away a few years prior, and the house had been sold to developers. I realized I didn't have much in common with him besides that house, but the alcohol from the mixer was buzzing in my system, so I asked him about it. I felt like enough time had passed that it was a funny anecdote now. I told him about what I had experienced in the turret room. The dragging footsteps, the turning doorknob, the silhouette in the chair. I even told my theory about it being his grandmother sleepwalking. I expected him to laugh or maybe get defensive about his grandma's mental state. But I was wrong. He went completely still. He put down the brass compass he was polishing and looked at me with a dead serious expression. He said, and I'll never forget the flat tone of his voice, "That wasn't Grandma, that was the captain." I listened in horror as he described things that were categorically worse than what I had experienced. He told me that when he was a kid, his parents would dump him at the inn for weeks during the summer. He slept in the turret room too. He said the figure wouldn't just sit in the chair. He said he would wake up because the bed would dip. He would feel the mattress sink down, right next to his legs, as if a heavy man was sitting on the edge of the bed. Then he would hear wet, heavy breathing. Not the shallow breath of an old woman, but the rattling, wet sound of lungs filled with fluid. He told me that one night, he kept his eyes open just a slit. He saw a man in a soaking wet wool coat, dripping seawater onto the floorboards. The man was facing away from him, hunched over, weeping silently. But that wasn't the worst part. Julian looked around the trade show floor to make sure no one was listening, then leaned in closer. "One night," he whispered, "I felt a hand on my ankle." He said he kept his eyes shut and remained frozen in place, praying it would stop. "It wasn't a normal hand," Julian said, his voice trembling slightly. "The skin was bloated, slippery, like it had been in the water for weeks. It squeezed my ankle, hard, like it was checking to see if I was real. I asked him how he knew it wasn't a prank or a nightmare, and he said, almost like it was obvious, because in the morning there was a bruise, a handprint-shaped bruise that took 2 weeks to fade, and the room smelled like low tide and rotting kelp for days." I looked at him in shock. I genuinely couldn't believe what he was telling me. Why would his grandmother let a child sleep in a room with that? I asked him that, and he said she didn't know. He said he told his dad about the occurrences once. His dad, Mrs. Gable's son, had slapped him and told him to stop making up stories to get attention. He said the house had a history of rumors involving a sea captain who drowned off the cliffs in the 1920s, and the family was sick of hearing about it. So, Julian stopped talking about it. He told himself that as long as he pretended to be asleep, the wet thing wouldn't take him back to the ocean. Hearing him tell me that was quite literally horrifying. Not only did it confirm everything I myself had been experiencing, but it recontextualized my entire winter there. The draft I felt wasn't a draft. It was the cold radiating off a drowned thing. The settling of the house wasn't wood expanding. It was the weight of a dead man dragging himself up the stairs. Julian and I stopped talking about it after that. He suddenly looked very tired, and I could tell both of us just wanted to walk away from the memory. But if it wasn't Mrs. Gable who was coming into my room at night, I don't like thinking about how close I came to something much worse. The way Julian described the bloated skin is something that still makes me nauseous. But is it any better thinking about the alternative? That implies there was a presence in that house that could physically mark you. A presence that waited for the lights to go out to drag its wet, heavy body up 3 flights of stairs just to watch young men sleep. I remember the night the charcoal was smeared across my sketchbook. At the time, I thought it was clumsy movement. Now I realize what it actually looked like. It looked like a smudge made by a wet, swollen thumb. I still have that sketchbook somewhere in my attic. I haven't opened it in 10 years. I'm afraid that if I look at that page closely now, with the knowledge I have, I might see a fingerprint embedded in the charcoal. And I don't know if I can handle knowing for sure that the thing in the turret room touched my things while I lay there, helpless and asleep, just inches away. I don't go near the ocean anymore. I live in Arizona now. It's dry here, but sometimes, when it rains hard and the wind hits the windows just right, I find myself counting to 60, waiting for the doorknob to turn. When I was 12 years old, my parents went through a nature phase. They decided that city life was rotting my brain, so they rented a cabin on the edge of Lake Osiris, deep in the Adirondacks, for the entire month of July. The cabin was isolated, sitting on a rocky outcropping that hooked out into the water. We were surrounded by pine trees so thick they blocked out the sun by 4 p.m. But across the inlet, maybe 50 yards of dark, still water, there was one other property. It was a modern A-frame house with a massive glass wall facing the lake and a long wooden jetty that stretched out into the water like a skeletal finger. For the first week, that house was empty. I spent my days skipping stones and trying to get a signal on my Game Boy, bored out of my mind. I used to sit on our porch with my dad's heavy binoculars, scanning the tree line, hoping to see a bear or a deer just to break the monotony. Anyway, one Tuesday, there actually was someone on the jetty across the water. It was a boy. He looked to be about my age, maybe a little younger, with pale blonde hair cut in a bowl shape. The thing that stood out immediately was his outfit. It was the middle of July, easily 80 degrees with 90% humidity. But this kid was wearing a heavy, bright red raincoat, the kind with the rubberized fabric and the silver clasps. He was standing at the very edge of the jetty, staring down into the black water. I watched him for a while, wondering if he was going to jump in, but he never did. Eventually, he looked up and saw me on my porch. He waved. It was a slow, stiff wave, like his arm was heavy. I waved back. Then, he turned and walked back toward the A-frame house, disappearing around the side. After that, we developed this silent routine. He would be out there every single day at roughly 2 p.m. He was always wearing that red raincoat, fully clasped up to his chin. We played games across the water. I would stand on my dock, and he would stand on his. We were close enough to see each other's movements clearly, but too far to hear anything over the sound of the wind in the pines and the lapping water. He would hold up objects, a pine cone, a smooth white rock, a fishing lure, and I would have to guess what they were by pantomiming. If I guessed right, miming a fishing cast, for example, he would clap his hands slowly. I would show him my comic books, holding them open so he could see the covers. He would give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down. On particularly hot days, I would shout over to him, "Hey, come swim," or "What's your name?" But he never shouted back. He would just shake his head and point to his throat, then to his ears. I figured he was deaf or mute. It made me feel protective of him. I imagined his parents were strict, forcing him to wear that coat to protect him from the sun or bugs or something. One day, I asked my mom about the neighbors. My mom said the property belonged to a Mr. Vance, a retired surgeon who came up for the fishing season. I told her about the kid in the red coat, and she said maybe his grandson was visiting. That made me kind of happy. It meant I wasn't the only prisoner of Lake Osiris. But there were weird things I ignored. For one, I never saw him enter or exit the A-frame house. He would just appear on the jetty. I'd look down to tie my shoe, look up, and he'd be there. And when he left, he always walked around the side of the house into the dense woods, never through the sliding glass doors. Also, the raincoat. He never took it off. Not once. Even when the heat index hit 95 and I was sweating in my swim trunks, he was buttoned up tight in that rubber shell. A few weeks later, things changed. I woke up around 3 a.m. to a sound. It was a rhythmic clank, clank, clank coming from the water. I walked over to the window of my loft bedroom and realized it was the boy. He was on the jetty. The moon was bright enough that I could see the red reflection of his coat in the water. This was strange, because I had never seen him at night. His curfew seemed to be strictly before sunset. He wasn't standing still like he normally did. He was pacing back and forth at the very end of the wood planks, waving his arms frantically. He pointed down at the water, then at me, then clapped his hands together like he was begging. I didn't know what he wanted. The lake was pitch black at night, an endless void. It started to scare me. It felt like a lure, like if I went out there, something would pull me in. So, I crawled back into bed and pulled the quilt over my head. The clanking sound, maybe his boots hitting the metal cleats on the dock, continued for 10 minutes, then stopped. He wasn't on the jetty for 3 days after that. I started thinking I had upset him by ignoring his distress signal. I sat on my dock for hours, waiting for a flash of red, but there was nothing. Just the empty gray wood and the dark water. But then on the 4th night, the sound woke me again. Clank, clank, clank. I went to the window. He was there, but he wasn't pacing this time. He was standing perfectly still, facing my cabin. He was holding something up. It looked like a sign. I grabbed my dad's binoculars from the sill and focused them. My hands were shaking, so it was hard to get a clear image, but when I did, my stomach dropped. It wasn't a sign. He was holding his coat open. Underneath the red raincoat, his shirt was wet. But it wasn't just wet. It was dark. There was a massive, jagged tear in his shirt, right in the center of his chest. His mouth was moving. He was screaming. I could tell by the way his jaw unhinged and his neck muscles strained. He was screaming at the top of his lungs, but there was absolutely no sound coming across the water. The night was dead silent, save for the crickets. He kept mouthing the same thing, over and over. Through the lenses, I could read his lips perfectly. "It's cold. It's cold. It's cold." Then he took a step back, right off the edge of the jetty. He didn't splash. He didn't hit the water. He just dissolved. 1 second he was falling, and the next, he was gone before he even touched the surface. Like a video glitch. I ran to my parents' room, screaming. My dad bolted out of bed, grabbed a flashlight, and ran to the porch. He shone the beam across the inlet, sweeping the jetty and the dark water. "There's no one there, Elias," he said, his voice rough with sleep. "The water is calm." My parents convinced me it was a nightmare induced by the isolation. They gave me a glass of warm milk and told me to stay away from the window. The next afternoon, after the boy didn't show up for our 2 p.m. appointment, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to know he was okay. I took our rowboat. I wasn't supposed to take it without a life vest or supervision, but I didn't care. I rowed across the inlet, my heart hammering in my throat. When I got to the other side, I tied up at the jetty. It looked older up close. The wood was rotting in places, and there were rusted nails sticking up. I walked up the path to the A-frame house. There was a car in the driveway, a vintage Jeep. I knocked on the door. After a minute, an older man answered. He looked like he hadn't shaved in a week. This was Mr. Vance. I smiled nervously. He didn't smile back. He looked confused to see a kid on his porch. I asked him about the boy. I asked if his grandson was around and if he was okay. Mr. Vance's face changed. The confusion vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, hollow devastation. He dropped the mug of coffee he was holding. It shattered on the porch, ceramic shards flying everywhere. But he didn't even blink. The way he went pale so abruptly kind of scared me. He asked, in a whisper, what the boy looked like. I told him. I described the bowl cut, the pale face, and the red raincoat with the silver clasps. Then Mr. Vance grabbed the door frame, his knuckles turning white. He told me to go home. He didn't yell, but his voice was shaking so bad it sounded like growling. "Get off my property," he said. "Don't come back." I ran back to the boat, thinking I was in trouble for trespassing. I rowed back as fast as I could. Things changed a lot after that day. I was pretty sure Mr. Vance called my parents, which made me think we were going to get evicted. My dad came into my room that night. He sat on the edge of my bed and looked uncomfortable. He said he had spoken to the neighbor. He told me we were leaving in the morning, a week early. When I asked why, he said it was just time to go. But I knew something was wrong. My mom wouldn't look at me while she packed the kitchen. It wasn't until I was in college, actually, that my dad finally explained things to me. We were fishing, years later, and he'd had a few beers. He told me what Mr. Vance had said on the phone that night. Apparently, Mr. Vance didn't have a grandson visiting. He lived alone. But he used to have a son named Timothy. Timothy was 12 years old in 1994. He drowned in the lake on a rainy afternoon in July. He had been fishing off the end of the jetty. He slipped on the wet wood and fell in. But he didn't just drown. He fell onto the propeller of the family boat, which was idling at the dock. The blade had caught him right in the chest. My dad took a long pull of his beer and refused to meet my eyes. He said that when they found the body, Timothy was wearing his favorite red raincoat. The family fell apart after that. Mrs. Vance left. Mr. Vance stayed, trapped in that house with the glass wall, drinking himself to death. My dad didn't really elaborate on the rest. I don't think he wanted to scare me, even as an adult. He just said that Mr. Vance told him, "He's been active this year. I thought he stopped, but he's active again." I'm 34 now. I live in a high-rise apartment in the city. I don't do lakes. I don't do pools. I don't even like bathtubs. I've had a couple of dreams about that boy on the jetty over the years. It's never a bad dream at first. We're just waving. He's showing me a pine cone, and I'm showing him a comic book. But he doesn't have a face in my dreams anymore. It's just a blur of static under that red hood. And the silence. The silence in the dream is so loud it wakes me up. This will forever be one of those memories that sits in the back of my throat like a stone. Because here's the thing that keeps me up at night. When Mr. Vance described the accident, he mentioned one detail that my dad slipped up and told me. He said that when Timothy fell in, he didn't die instantly. He was in the water for 10 minutes before he passed. He was conscious. He was trying to signal for help. When I saw him that night, pointing at the water, clapping his hands, he wasn't haunting me. He was reliving it. He was begging me to pull him out. And the worst part? When I looked through the binoculars that last night and saw him open his coat, I realized something about the stain I saw. It wasn't just a wound. The tear in the raincoat, the hole in his chest, it was pulsing. He was still dying. He's been dying on that jetty for 30 years, over and over again, waiting for someone to finally understand what he's trying to say. It's cold. I think about that every time it rains. I think about a little boy in a red coat, shivering in the dark water, waiting for a friend who is never going to come.